I remember that morning with a clarity that still shakes me. Even after so many decades, the sun was rising over Oahu, the air heavy with salt and the smell of fuel. The sounds of footsteps echoed on the deck. The clang of metal rang as hatches were opened and closed. The laughter of young sailors filled the air. Boys who had no idea that within an hour many of them would never laugh again. We were boys, mostly some barely 18, others 20 or 21. I was 19 and thought I had the whole world ahead of me. That Sunday began like any other. A quiet routine, breakfast in the mess hall, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee strong enough to burn the tongue. We talked about weekend plans, about girls back home, about letters we hope would arrive that afternoon. Some men played cards, others polished brass. Some were already writing in notebooks, never imagining those would be their last words. I leaned against the rail, looking at the calm water. The harbor seemed so peaceful that day. You could almost believe the war was far away, across the ocean. The first sound came not from sirens, but from the sky. A low rumble like distant thunder. At first, no one cared. We thought maybe it was training or another squadron flying maneuvers. But then the sound grew louder. The engines were unlike the ones we knew. Higher pitched, more urgent. Someone shouted, "Look up!" And I did. Dark shapes came out of the morning sun. And in that instant, the world tore open. Planes with red circles on their wings dove down, their engines screaming. The first explosion struck before I even realized what I was seeing. Water erupted in columns of spray and smoke. Flames leapt from ships. I heard men screaming, orders clanging, bells, the metallic hammer of guns opening fire. But it was too late. The enemy was already upon us. I froze for a heartbeat, shock holding me still. Then instinct forced me to move. I ran across the deck as bullets stitched the steel around me, sparks flying, chips of paint ripping into my face. One man beside me fell, clutching his chest. I wanted to stop, to help him, but another blast threw me forward, the shock wave slamming me against the bulkhead. My ears rang, my vision blurred. I remember tasting metal in my mouth, dust and smoke choking me. Men were yelling, medics, gunners, loaders. The chaos of voices all blending into one roar. I forced myself to my feet, stumbling toward the nearest gun station, even though I had never trained for this kind of attack. Not like this, not against real enemy planes, raining hell from the sky. The smell is what I remember most. Burning oil, burning flesh, the acrid sting of cordite. Every breath felt like swallowing fire. We tried to fight back, dragging ammunition boxes, loading shells, hands trembling, hearts pounding. Some guns fired, some jammed. Others were blown apart before they could even be manned. Above us, Japanese planes swooped low, their machine guns cutting across decks, tearing men apart. I saw one sailor waving a pistol at the sky, screaming in fury, firing useless rounds as the plane banked away. Another tried to throw a wrench at it. Desperation in his eyes. Everything felt unreal, like some nightmare you beg to wake from, but cannot, because it is real and it is endless. When the Arizona exploded, the blast shook the harbor like the earth itself had split. The fireball rose into the sky, black smoke boiling upward. I felt the heat even from where I stood. Men were thrown into the water, pieces of ship raining down. One moment, it was a battleship, proud and immense. The next, it was a grave. The screams that followed still echo inside me. Hundreds of men trapped below decks, their cries muffled by steel and fire. We could not reach them. We could not save them. We could only listen until their voices faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the roar of the attack overhead. I found myself beside a friend, Billy. We had met in training. He was shouting orders, though he had no authority, just trying to keep men moving. He grabbed my arm and pointed toward the smoke rising from the harbor. "We have to fight," he yelled, his face blackened with soot and fear in his eyes. But steady at the same time, he loaded shells into a gun, handed me the belt, and together we fired into the sky. I did not know if we hit anything. Maybe we did, maybe not. What mattered was the act of fighting back, refusing to die quietly, refusing to let terror consume us. The attack grew fiercer with every passing minute. The sound of engines and explosions mixed into one endless roar. The sky above was filled with dark silhouettes, diving and circling like hawks over prey. I kept my hands on the gun, feeding the belt, while Billy fired bursts upward. Our hearts pounded so loud I could hear nothing else but the steady hammer of machine guns and the rising smoke that turned the morning sun into a dull red glow. It felt as if time had shattered into fragments, each second filled with fear and determination, each breath heavy with the smell of burning oil. The Oklahoma began to list to her side, water rushing into her hull. Men scrambled across the decks, trying to escape before she rolled completely. I saw dozens leaping into the harbor, some swimming desperately away, others clinging to debris. The sight froze me for a moment. It was not a ship anymore, but a trap swallowing those inside. I could hear faint shouts carried by the wind, cries for help that made my chest ache. Because we could not reach them, we could not stop what was happening. It was chaos beyond anything training had prepared us for. And yet there was no time to think, only to move and survive. Orders shouted across decks were lost in the noise, but instinct drove us from one place to another, dragging hoses, hauling ammunition, pointing weapons skyward whenever a new wave of planes descended. Every man did whatever he could. Even if it seemed useless, courage did not feel like bravery. It felt like refusing to stop, even when nothing made sense. I remember crouching behind a gun shield for cover as another series of bombs fell. The concussion blasted through my chest, the deck trembling beneath my boots, the air so thick with smoke it was hard to breathe. Then came the moment when Billy and I were forced to abandon our position. Fire was spreading too close, explosions tearing through nearby compartments. We ran, stumbling across the deck, shouting at others to follow. The water around the ship was covered with flames from leaking fuel. Men were jumping anyway, preferring the chance of the sea to certain death on board. I hesitated at the edge. The harbor looked like a burning mirror, reflecting the chaos above, but Billy grabbed my arm and shouted, "We have no choice." Together we leapt. The heat washed over us as we plunged beneath the surface. The shock of the water nearly stole my breath. It was cold, despite the fire above. A jolt that cleared my mind. I kicked hard, pushing away from the flames, breaking the surface in open water around me. Men thrashed and shouted, some calling for help, others silently swimming through the haze. The noise above never stopped. Engines, guns, bombs, the entire world still collapsing, even as we fought just to stay afloat. I saw ships burning, battleships listing, destroyers firing wildly into the sky. It was as if the harbor itself had turned into a battlefield where there was no safe ground. We swam toward a section of floating debris, using it as cover, clinging to it whenever strafing runs swept across the water. Bullets snapped the surface in deadly lines. The terror of those moments is hard to describe. It was not just fear of dying, but fear that no one would ever know what became of us, that we would vanish in the smoke and chaos, lost among the countless others who would never return. But clinging to that thought also gave me strength. I wanted to live, not just for myself, but to tell the story, to make sure the world would know what had happened here. Billy kept me moving, his voice steady even when mine shook. "We can make it," he said over and over, as if repeating it would make it true. His determination carried me through the water, stroke by stroke, until finally we reached a section of the harbor where sailors and small boats were already pulling men from the sea. Strong arms hauled us aboard. Coughing, choking, but alive, the relief in that moment was overwhelming, though the sight around us was still a nightmare. Flames still rising, ships still burning, the sky still filled with enemy planes. The battle was far from over. The small boat rocked as more men were dragged from the water, their faces blackened by smoke, their eyes wide with shock. Some coughed so hard they could barely breathe, while others sat in silence, staring at the burning harbor as if their minds could not grasp what had happened. I clung to the wooden rail, trying to steady myself, the salt water stinging my eyes, the smoke filling my lungs. We were alive, but it did not feel like survival. It felt like waking into another world, one where nothing familiar remained. From the boat, the view was worse than from the deck. The entire harbor seemed on fire. Ships that had stood proudly minutes before were now twisted silhouettes against the sky, flames crawling across their decks. Thick black smoke rising so high it seemed to block out the sun. The Arizona was a glowing wound in the water, The Oklahoma was already rolled. The Nevada was trying desperately to move down the channel under a rain of bombs and torpedoes. I remember thinking how fragile everything looked for all their steel and size. The ships were helpless against the storm above. We pulled in more survivors, each one adding to the weight of the boat and to the heavy silence that clung to us between the crashes of explosions. Some men cried openly. Others clenched their fists in fury, muttering words I could not make out. I tried to help wherever I could, reaching out to grab hands, hauling men aboard, offering space for those too weak to move. My arms ached, but I did not stop, because it gave me purpose in the middle of chaos. Then the planes came back, the second wave. Engines screamed as they dived again, tracers and bombs raining down. The water around us erupted into fountains of spray, the shock waves slamming against the boat. Men ducked instinctively, some throwing themselves flat, but there was nowhere to hide. We watched helplessly as more ships were hit, as columns of smoke rose from hangars along the shore, as the harbor turned into a nightmare without end. Yet even in that moment, there was no thought of surrender, only the will to endure. The gunners who still lived fought back with everything they had. The staccato of anti-aircraft fire rattled through the air, the occasional cheer rising when a Japanese plane burst into flame, but the cheers were brief, drowned by the reality of the destruction. The sky was full of them, too many for us to stop. We were only witnesses to the struggle, clinging to our small boat while the fate of the Pacific was being decided above our heads. I remember locking eyes with Billy across the boat, his face streaked with water and soot, his expression somewhere between terror and determination. We did not speak, but the message was clear. We had survived this far, and we would hold on no matter what the enemy threw at us, around us. Sailors prayed aloud. Some shouted the names of loved ones. Others simply closed their eyes, waiting for the end, but the end did not come. At least not for us. Not yet. When the attack finally began to recede, when the last echoes of engines faded into the distance, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise before. It was not true silence, but a hollow ringing, broken only by the crackle of flames, the groan of damaged ships, and the moans of wounded men. It was a silence that carried the weight of thousands of lives changed in less than 2 hours. I felt it pressing on my chest harder than any explosion, the realization that nothing would ever be the same. We rowed toward the shore, our boat crowded with survivors, some lying still, others whispering prayers. The harbor around us was a graveyard of smoke and fire. Every stroke of the oar felt endless. But the sight of land gave us strength. We wanted solid ground under our feet, even if that ground was littered with debris and shadowed by destruction. As we approached the dock, men reached down to pull us in, their hands strong, their faces pale with the same disbelief we carried. They asked if we were hurt, if more were coming behind us. We had no answers. Only the images burned into our minds. When my boots finally touched the wooden planks of the dock, I felt both relief and dread. Relief to stand again, dread because I did not know what waited next. The air was still thick with smoke, the sound of secondary explosions echoing through the harbor. Ambulances rushed back and forth, soldiers shouted orders, tried to impose some kind of order on the chaos. I followed with the others, stumbling toward makeshift aid stations, where doctors and nurses worked frantically over the endless stream of wounded. I was alive, but in that moment survival felt almost heavier than death. On the dock I tried to steady my legs, but they shook beneath me. The world was still ringing from the roar of bombs, the harbor still belching smoke into the sky. Everywhere I looked, men were running, carrying stretchers, dragging hoses, shouting orders that seemed swallowed by the chaos. I forced myself to move, to do something, because standing still felt impossible. I joined a group pulling wounded sailors from small boats and laying them on the pier. Some groaned in pain, others were too quiet. The medics worked with hands that never paused, their faces pale but their eyes locked on the task before them. I searched every face I passed, hoping to find the friends I'd trained with, the men who had shared meals and jokes only hours before. Some I spotted bandaged and bloodied but alive, others I never saw again. And in that silence between explosions, I realized that for many there would be no reunion, no chance to laugh again. I carried that weight like a stone in my chest and kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. The fires raged on, ships still burning long after the planes had gone. Hoses sprayed arcs of water that hissed against the flames. Smoke rolled across the harbor, so thick it coated my tongue with bitterness. I could barely see the outlines of ships that only this morning had stood proud and gleaming. Now twisted and shattered, some were still slipping beneath the surface, leaving behind oil slicks that spread like dark shadows on the waves. The water itself seemed poisoned, carrying wreckage. And bodies alike, it was a sight I could not turn from, yet could hardly bear to see. Someone shouted that the enemy might return, and a ripple of fear went through everyone at once. Men ducked instinctively, eyes scanning the sky for new shapes. The air raid sirens wailed again, and hearts pounded, but the sky remained empty. We still believed another wave was coming at any moment, and that dread drove us to keep working faster, clearing debris, loading wounded in ambulances, stacking supplies on the pier. The fear of another attack was almost worse than the attack itself. Every distant sound made us flinch. Every shadow overhead felt like death returning. As night began to fall, the fires still burned, lighting the harbor with an orange glow that turned the water into liquid flame. The crackle of collapsing steel echoed across the bay, and still men searched the wrecks for survivors. Crawling into twisted compartments, calling out names, their lanterns flickering in the smoke, I joined them when I could, my body exhausted but my mind unwilling to stop. We pulled men from the water, half drowned but alive. We carried others who would never wake. The silence between shouts was filled with the weight of loss. Billy stayed close, his face set hard, his hands blistered from hauling ropes and debris. We did not speak much. Words felt useless. We worked side by side until our arms felt like lead, until our throats ached from smoke and shouting. We had no thought of rest. Only the next task, the next chance to save someone, as if by doing so we could fight back against the helplessness that threatened to swallow us. At some point, I realized the entire base had changed. It was not a harbor anymore, but a battlefield, a hospital, and a graveyard all at once. The men around me were no longer sailors at ease, but survivors hardened in a single day. We looked at each other differently after that morning. No longer boys talking of home and letters, but men who had seen too much and carried scars invisible to anyone who had not been there. When I finally sat down on the edge of the dock, my clothes soaked with seawater and sweat, my hands shaking uncontrollably, I looked out across the harbor. The silhouettes of ruined ships still smoldered against the night sky. I thought of how only hours before, the water had been calm, the decks filled with laughter, and how quickly it had all turned into nightmare. I felt anger rise in me, sharper than the fear, anger at the attack, at the lives stolen, at the innocents burned away, but mixed with that anger was a vow, deep inside me, that if I lived, I would never forget this day, never allow the memory of these men to fade. That night felt longer than any I had ever lived. The sky over Pearl Harbor glowed with fires that refused to die, turning the clouds a deep orange that could be seen for miles. The air was heavy with smoke and ash. Every breath scraped the throat. Every cough reminded us that the attack was not a nightmare, but reality. The harbor, once a symbol of American pride, was now twisted wreckage. Ships lay broken in the water like fallen giants. The silence between the crackle of flames was filled with the groans of the wounded and the restless movement of men who could not sleep. We were told to stay alert because no one knew if the enemy would return. Some said they would land troops that very night. Others swore they had seen submarines waiting just beyond the harbor. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture. Every shadow looked like an enemy. Every distant sound like another wave of planes. We carried rifles now, slung across our shoulders, walking patrol along the shoreline with nerves so sharp that even the rustle of wind through palm trees made us grip our weapons tighter. My heart hammered so loud, I could hear it over the quiet. We gathered in small groups around lanterns, or just sat in the dark waiting, talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some men swore vengeance, their words fierce through clenched teeth. Others sat staring at the ground. Unable to speak, I listened, but said little. The images in my mind were too heavy to put into words. Billy sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean met the sky. He whispered once, "Do you think they will come back?" I had no answer, because the truth was I did not know. Food was handed out hastily. Cold rations passed from box to hand. No one cared about taste. We ate mechanically, just to keep strength. The smoke made everything bitter anyway, water tasting like ash. The medics still worked without pause, their hands stained, their voices hoarse. The aid stations overflowed with the wounded, men lying on cots or directly on the ground. Some called for family, others drifted in silence. The nurses moved from one to another with a determination that amazed me, their faces tight with fatigue, but never stopping, never hesitating. They were as much soldiers as any of us. Rumors spread quickly, filling the night with whispers. Some said entire Japanese fleets were on their way. Others swore that Los Angeles had been bombed too. We had no way to know the truth, and every new rumor dug deeper into our nerves. So we prepared for everything, stacking sandbags, loading rifles, positioning machine guns along the shorelines, as if we expected invasion by dawn. The tension kept us awake, eyes darted to the dark horizon, ears straining for the sound of engines that never came. When I finally closed my eyes for a few minutes, leaning against a crate, the images rushed back unbidden. The roar of planes, the fireball that consumed the Arizona, the desperate cries of men trapped below decks. I jerked awake, drenched in sweat, my hands trembling. For a moment, I did not know if I was still dreaming or back in a nightmare. Around me, men shifted uneasily in their sleep, some calling out names, some waking with the same haunted look. It was clear none of us would rest. That night, at dawn, the fires were still burning, smoke still rising. The harbor was revealed more fully in the pale light, the devastation clearer than ever. Ships that had been the pride of the fleet were reduced to wrecks. Oil still spread across the water. Bodies were still being pulled from the ruins. The scale of it pressed down on us. Heavy and merciless, we stood together on the docks, silent as the sun rose. Not with warmth, but with the cold reminder that the world had changed forever. The war had come to us, and nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed passed in a blur, yet every moment carved itself into my memory. We worked without pause, clearing debris, hauling hoses, dragging twisted steel aside, searching wrecks for any chance of survivors. Deep down, we knew the search was more often for bodies than for the living. The harbor smelled of smoke and oil for weeks after the attack, and every breath carried that bitter taste into our lungs. We were the same clothes, soaked in ash and sweat, our hands blistered raw, our eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. I remember standing on the deck of what remained of one of the ships, staring at the blackened hulk where hundreds of men had been trapped. Their voices were gone now, replaced by silence. It was not just metal that had sunk, it was youth and laughter and dreams and whole lives that would never continue. Some men we pulled free and laid in rows beneath sheets. Others we never recovered, their resting place forever beneath the calm waters that would return once the fires died. I whispered names to myself, as if saying them aloud might keep them alive in memory. Every evening we gathered for briefings, where commanders spoke of rebuilding defenses and preparing for whatever came next. Their voices were steady, though their eyes betrayed exhaustion. They told us the fleet would rise again, that America would strike back, that we had not been broken. And we listened, hungry for direction, hungry for a purpose beyond survival. At night, we still feared another attack. But with each passing day, our fear hardened into resolve. The shock of the first strike slowly turned into determination. Funerals came quickly, sometimes with ceremony, sometimes without, depending on the chaos of the moment. Chaplains spoke prayers over rows of flag-covered caskets, while men stood silent, caps in hand, eyes fixed on the ground. The sound of taps played over the harbor, carried on the wind, and every note seemed to pierce deeper than any bomb could. Those were the hardest moments, harder even than the fight itself, because in those silences we had time to feel the weight of what we had lost. Yet there was pride too, pride in those who had fought back, Pride in the gunners who fired until their guns were torn apart. Pride in the sailors who risked their lives to pull others from the flames. Pride in knowing that even in disaster, courage had not deserted us. We clung to that pride because it gave meaning to the suffering. It reminded us that we were not just victims, but fighters who had endured the unendurable. Letters from home began to arrive days later, filled with shock and questions. Families desperate for news. Mothers begging to know if their sons were safe. Fathers writing of their anger and their resolve. We wrote back as best we could, careful with our words, hiding details that would only bring pain. But in every letter we promised the same thing, that we would stand, that we would fight, that we would make sure the sacrifice of December 7th would not be in vain. When the news spread across the country, I later heard how the nation had reacted, how lines formed outside recruitment offices, how factories began working day and night, how neighbors hung flags from their porches in solidarity. We knew then that Pearl Harbor had not only scarred us who had been there, but had awakened an entire nation. The sleeping giant had been struck, and it would not rest again until the war was finished. For me, the harbor never looked the same again. Even after repairs, even after ships returned, the memories lingered. Every time I saw the calm water, I remembered the flames. Every time I heard the sound of engines, I remembered that morning when the sky turned black with fire. Yet alongside the pain came a vow, a promise carried deep in my chest, to honor those who had fallen by living fully and by never letting the world forget what happened that day. I survived Pearl Harbor, but part of me will always remain there, among the smoke and the fire and the voices of friends who never came home. I tell this story not for myself, but for them, because memory is the only way we keep them alive, and because the world must remember how fragile peace can be, how quickly ordinary mornings can turn into history. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we bring more untold stories of World War II back to life.